They're depriving younger, less experienced workers of the opportunity to suffer through that work, but develop judgment while they're suffering through that work.
Quantum physics impacts our life in many ways, and it actually
Right.
impacts classical computing as well when you get down to a certain size. So these are not, theoretical things, they're very real.
Hello again, Peter.
Hey, David, how are you today?
I'm good. I'm good. How about yourself?
I'm good. I am, David, I'm warm. I'm happy. I can't complain. I know I keep rubbing it into everybody, but I'm going to keep rubbing it in for a little bit longer at least.
Oh, well, still in New York City in the winter, so I'm not warm, but I can't complain. Um,
You know
hey,
what?
do you know it's a red letter day for us?
It is. It is. And when our producer mentioned it to us, I was taken aback. I didn't realize it was, in fact, we'll call it a little bit of a celebratory day. It's
Yes.
episode number 50.
In some ways, it feels like we've done more than 50 of these, but in other ways, I look back and I'm like, oh, 50 is a pretty good number of podcasts to do.
Yeah, it is. But you know what, though? It's funny. Just looking back at this journey for the last, what is it, about a year now, I guess, when we finally started.
Yeah.
It's I had a friend of mine who watch our podcast and who is formerly it was an actor, so he's I trust his judgment when he says things. And he looked at it and he goes, Peter, I've looked at you from the beginning and I look at you and David now, and I got to tell you, he says it is a dramatic difference in how much more refined and better you two have gotten over the past year. But yeah, who would have thought a year? I never would have imagined you and I sit in front of a camera for a year. It's kind of amazing that we're actually still doing this. And I tell you, I
Maybe
love
we
it more
should.
than ever.
It's been a lot of fun. Maybe we should ask the producers to edit in a couple of like clips of us being very awkward and hesitant when we
I
did
love
this
that
in
idea.
like episode 1 or 2, because I'm sure, even though it feels like it's just more of the same, I'm sure we're better at this than we were 50 episodes ago.
Yep. So I'm
So
glad we
makes it
did it, and
easier.
I'm looking forward to the next course.
Yeah, me too. No, I'm definitely. It was a good time. Uh, you know, again, learning experience. And these are the. Yeah, I don't know where I'm going with any of this now.
I always like the way the Click and Clack, the Tappert brothers, wrapped up their show. They'd always say like, "Well, it's happened again. You've wasted another perfectly good hour listening to us talk about AI."
I'm sure we're a lot better, and it's funny because I remember the numbers. Like I remember when we did this on initially on LinkedIn Live, and they were live on a Thursday at like 11 o'clock, and I would send invites to 2,000 people, and some days we'd get a fair amount to show up, and there were times there was 3 people, and it was you and me.
Right.
And so
Right.
it was an awkward time. I expect that in a live podcast, but we were awkward at first, but it's amazing how much it's changed and how much better that I think we've gotten. And with the live studio, it's just an incredible experience. You and I in the same place, and so yeah, congratulations.
Yeah, I think that the studio was a big part of it. So now that we actually have a home base studio in New York City that we can sit in the same room and interact directly,
Yes,
and more importantly, we can have guests. Now, ironically, because of our travel schedules, we're not in the same place today, but usually we are going forward. So that's been great. And the guests have
yes,
been a game changer.
yeah. I think we've had some fantastic guests, which has really been, I think, like you said, it's been a real big game changer, and we hope to have a lot more in the future.
Yeah,
I mean,
we've been lucky because we've gotten some fantastic guests, as you said. We've gotten people from everything from the medical industry to obviously lots of people in the software industry, an expert in AI and higher education. I mean,
yes.
just been really interesting.
We've had some really interesting discussions, and when we started this journey, and I honestly never would have called that, but I'm always, I would say, surprised, but I am very happy with where we landed, and I really expect the next 50 to be even better. It's just, yeah, it's been a great experience. So we just want to thank everybody. I mean, look, we now have thousands of subscribers. We have, I want to say, many hundreds of thousands of views. Like when I go look at the numbers, every time I'm completely blown away. So yeah, it's been a great experience.
Yeah, yeah, and we're gonna continue to try new things and experiment and have
Yes.
interesting guests and other things. In fact, a little bit of a teaser. Coming up, we will have a guest, not immediately, but in the next several episodes, we're going to be working. We're going to be talking about AI and its impact on art and artists, which is a
Yes.
topic you and I just sort of banter about, whether it's photography or music or movie making. Like
Yes.
we're often talking about this.
Yeah, it's odd how you and I centered on just we both have this, even though we're both engineers and technologists and this, but we both love art and we both have, all our hobbies or in, other cases are centered around creating art in some way, shape, or form, which I
Yeah.
find really interesting. So
Yeah.
yeah, I think I cannot wait to have them on. I think it's going to be a phenomenal episode and fascinating. So
Yeah,
yeah,
so
that's
we're going to
something
have
I'm
some
really looking forward to.
real live working musicians join us, and we're going to go into an in-depth conversation about how AI is impacting art in general and the impact it's having on music and the music business. And I think it's going to be a fantastic conversation. I'm really excited about that one.
I am super excited by that one. That's the one I really can't wait to happen. I mean, there's other ones I was really, they were great episodes, but I think this is, again, this is a passion. We'll call it a passion project for you and I. So yeah, this is
Yeah.
great.
Yeah. Well, I mean, today we're going to talk about another topic that has been kind of a recurring theme for us, but we're going to go deep on it.
Yeah.
And that is like how humans need to learn and be taught and interact with AI and the impact in the workplace.
Right, right. And you and I have been, again, I don't know, we tend to go down some of these tangents sometimes and, wanted to be different, but we kind of caught on to it, I think, very early in the cycle about the importance of critical thinking and maintaining good judgment. And it's been a topic that you and I have discussed probably 100 times on and off camera, and certainly in front of clients. We've spoken about the necessity of good judgment and critical thinking skills and how they appear to be lacking in many cases, or they're just not. It's not taught anymore. I think is a big part of the problem as well. So, yeah, this is going to be a
Yeah.
really, I think, interesting discussion. When we came on this article, I think it kind of brought it home for us and articulated it in a way that was really clear.
Yeah, the article teed up the problem in a very, very clear way, and then we had our own thoughts about what the path
Right.
forward is. So we'll get into all of that. So first, the articles, it came out fairly recently in the HBR, the Harvard Business Review. It was by David Duncan, and the title of the article is "How Do Workers Develop Good Judgment in the AI Era?" And I thought it was a very well written article, very easy to understand. So if you're interested after hearing us talk about it, do go sign into HBR and check out the article that David Duncan wrote.
Yeah.
So yeah, so do you want to kind of tee up like what was the premise of the article?
It's teaching judgment in the modern age of AI, and it's that's the high level of it. But I think the deeper problem is ultimately how do you teach AI? How do you teach judgment in the era of AI? Because paradoxically, AI, in eliminating, or I can say eliminate, I hate to use that term, but reducing the need for junior employees, at least at this stage, at that
Right.
point in your life, when you really develop judgment, you're those that they're not going to learn it anymore. So it increases judgment, but it also takes away. So it's kind of a, it's a
Yeah.
bit of a
It
paradox.
it was an interesting paradox. So let's work our way up to that paradox, which I think is sort of the crux of the article. And let's start with judgment. Like, why is it that people are even talking about humans needing judgment in the AI era? For those who haven't heard us talk about
Right.
this before, let's talk about like what is the role of people evolving into, or what might it evolve into.
Well, you and I, again, we've hit on this multiple times, and that more so than ever, you need those judgment skills, those ability to assess what's coming out of artificial intelligence models, and you cannot accept it for
Yeah.
just face value. That they are statistical tools, and they're not always right, and that you have to really think about what you're being presented with. And what we're seeing in the marketplace, and I think, unfortunately, what a lot of the frontier model providers have basically said is, oh, you can just put these tools out and magic occurs. And that is
Right.
most definitely not the case. But I
Right.
think,
And so we
all,
we land at this concept that has become sort of widely accepted of human in the loop, right? And the
right,
idea is that that human in the loop is the final judge, if you will, the final circuit breaker to make sure that what the AI is doing is accurate, appropriate, correct, ethical, or any host of other things, right? So like that human is sort of supposed to be the ultimate arbiter to make sure everything is working okay.
But the author brought up a really valid point, and I think one that we had overlooked, which was the human in the loop. While it's critical, it's not a role where you're going to get judgment knowledge. It's really a control function at the end of the day, and you're not necessarily developing the skills of judgment through that human in the loop. So you might put somebody that's younger into a human in the loop type of a role, but that individual doesn't have necessarily the skills or the deep business knowledge or the domain knowledge or whatever else that they might have learned earlier on in their careers. And that's really super important to have those judgment skills, that knowledge, those critical thinking skills.
In fact, there have been reports from companies that have implemented a human in the loop framework that when those humans are not sufficiently, I'll say, senior and seasoned and experienced, one of two phenomena starts to occur. One is if the AI starts to have some errors that they catch, some documented errors, they quickly start to almost by default override the AI. They lose confidence. They don't trust it. They take this absolutist approach. It was wrong a few times, so now it's going to be wrong all the time. I'm not going to trust it. Or even more insidious is that if it's right significant portions of the time, and these again are less experienced people who may not have deep expertise of their own in the topic, the process, whatever the model is dealing with, they just start to defer to the AI. And in either case, it's either over-reliance or under-reliance on AI, but in either case, they quickly stop being effective humans in the loop, which defeats the whole purpose.
No, I think you summed it up precisely. But you think about when we were young, what we didn't know, and I always relate to those that are more junior. There's the subtlety of life that you gain with knowledge and experience, and you develop that through breaking things, through learning when you're young, to doing research, like all those basic types of functions that you learn in a beginning job. And I look back on my first role when I got out of college, and I'll say to this day, I got out of college, you think you're smart, but you know absolutely nothing. And I knew absolutely nothing. And I think about all the things I learned fairly quickly through working with people that were much older than myself, and provided me with insight and knowledge, and which over time I learned some deep skills. But I think you're very spot on. You put a junior person in a role like that, and it's just going to go sideways quickly.
So I like what you said about subtlety, right? Because that sort of dovetails into the author's premise about how people develop a good sense of judgment. And again, judgment becomes, there was a good definition of judgment in the article, which sort of reminds me of the way that I always defined the need for guardrails. They said judgment is defined as the capacity to act wisely in situations where pre-existing rules by themselves are insufficient, right? Which is, when I talk about why we need guiding principles, it's the same thing. It's to make unanticipated decisions where you haven't thought about the rules and the framework, but you have to make a decision, right? So the premise is that judgment comes from months or years of doing rote, repetitive, seemingly low value stuff, but that you learn the subtle nuances of what's right and wrong, what's good and bad, by doing this grunt work over and over again. Is that kind of the way you read it?
Yeah, no, that's exactly the way I read it. And it's funny because AI is initially going for a lot of its low level considered grunt work, but you look back in your career and you see a lot of that low level grunt work is really where you learned a lot. You didn't realize you were learning as much as you are, but you actually learned a lot of stuff. And eliminating that, so now you have those now managing agents or supervising processes that don't have that expertise anymore. They haven't developed those core basic skills. And I call them thinking. Some call it something else, but it's just being able to think. I think when you're young, you think you could think, but really you can't think. That doesn't come until later.
I want to come back. I want to come back to that in a minute about thinking, because I think that not all thinking is equal, and we should talk through that, because I think that's part of, when you say thinking, I hear it in a very specific way, knowing you and how you think. But this idea of getting experience through, or building judgment through lived experience is a really good point, right? All those times when I would attempt to make a PowerPoint deck and I'd think it was right. And then my manager early in my career would say, no, you've got the storyline all wrong. You need to lay it out this way, right? I guess in some sense I was developing a judgment over the right way to do things. And that judgment was sort of what I was being told by coworkers and peers, but it was also what I observed, right? If my manager said, no, tell the story this way, and then I sat in the back of the room during the meeting and I saw the meeting not go well, and I saw the other people receiving that message maybe be confused, maybe in my judgment, I'm like, oh, maybe that isn't exactly the right storyline. Maybe I would go back and say, well, I think mine was better. Who knows, right? But like it's this iterative process of just tiny little signals that you accumulate over a period of time. Right.
It's those,
so the
right.
problem, go ahead.
No, go ahead, please, go ahead. No, please, feel free.
So I was going to say, so the problem that this article points out is exactly what you said a minute ago, which is the entire goal of AI in many business processes is to replace that grunt work, that rote work. And in doing so, they're depriving future generations, maybe that sounds corny, but they're depriving younger, less experienced workers of the opportunity to suffer through that work, but develop judgment while they're suffering through that work. That's kind of the takeaway from that?
No, I think that's very fair. And I think you hit the nail on the head. It's you're suffering through that grunt work, and you don't realize it at the time, even though it's grunt work and you hate it. But you're developing a set of skills. But I think more importantly, you're developing a different set of perspectives. I mean, to me, life is about experience, and experiences cause you to gain knowledge. And the more experiences you have, and the more knowledge you're going to gain. And part of that's grunt work. Like you said, sitting in a meeting and observing and watching. But you're learning, you're learning different perspectives. You're learning more information. It's another. How can I say it? The deeper your knowledge, the richer your experiences, I think, in life, or just doing things, you develop there's definitely a sense of subtlety of things. And when you look at a situation, it's not black and white. And when you're young, it's black and white, or maybe it's 3 shades of gray. But as you get older, it's 10,000 shades of gray. And you catch all the nuances. You catch the nuances in people's facial expressions and how they handle meetings and all this other stuff that you just gain over time, and you can't substitute that. And I'm sorry, a model can't replace that anytime soon.
But, however, as you're saying that, I'm agreeing, but then I'm thinking about people I've known who didn't fit that mold at all. And so what I'm saying is I think that there are some people who can do that rote task over and over again and never take a single insight away from it. I think there are a lot of people who will do it, and even if they don't realize they're building knowledge or judgment or whatever we want to call it, they will be, right? They'll be, and it comes down to, maybe this comes back to what we're going to talk about around, thinking, but it comes down to their thinking patterns, and are they paying attention? Are they open to receiving that new information? Are they inquisitive? Or are they just saying, just let me get this one done and move on to the next one, right? And we've all seen people who, and I'm not casting aspersions, we're all wired differently, but there certainly are people out there who could do the same thing 1,000 times and never notice the pattern that someone else could do it 100 times and immediately be like, hey, there's this thing that's happening, recurring, and I wonder why that is.
Well, I think you're exactly right. And I had a discussion before this, before we had started the podcast today. I was speaking to a friend of mine, and we were talking about the implications of AI in the workforce. And his assessment was there are going to be a number of individuals, large, who are going to be untrainable. And I think a lot of that is, there are just a class of individuals, whether it's AI or something else, or some other transformation in the marketplace, or how they do their work, that really struggle with changing or growing or developing further. And they're comfortable doing the same thing over and over again and never really gaining from it. And I think that's very true. And it's going to be during this transitionary period, which yet to be defined how long it will be. It could be 1 year, it could be 20 years. I don't think any of us really know. There will certainly be those that are going to struggle with that. But
I do wonder, though, if that untrainable nature is a fixed characteristic of people, or if it's a result of how they've been taught, what they've been taught.
No, I think that's a really valid point. Yeah, I think that's a really valid point. And I feel like I will place some of the blame on the educational system, I think, with some of this, because when you're taught rote stuff. You're not taught to think, and I think that's a problem. And that creativity is beat out of you, because I think we'll go back to what we talked about in the past. Play is a beautiful thing, and that play gets beat out of you as you get older for a whole number of reasons. Part education system, part the domain you went down, or whatever it may be. And I think you're right, but
Right.
getting
There's
people
cultural
back to that
aspects.
point.
There's all sorts of things that impact
Exactly.
how people. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So
So whether it's an inherent characteristic of their biology or whether it's the way they've been taught and trained, there are these people who just possibly are unretrainable or don't have and may not be able to acquire the skills that we're going to talk about, right?
yes.
But even assuming we're talking about the subset of those people who do learn by doing and do pick up on those subtleties and see the patterns, or maybe they feel the patterns over time, because part of the way I read this article is it's not even all things that you can articulate that you're learning. It's just that sort of innate sense that you build about, what good looks like. And early,
Right.
people talk about, oh, I had a gut feel this was going to go wrong. They may not know why their gut told them something was off, but there clearly was. And there's entire books about this. There was the very pop culture book a few years ago, The Gift of Fear, that took that idea to the extreme. But the underlying premise that we do develop the intuitive ability to see and recognize patterns that we can't articulate, and we
Right.
can use that skill. That I think is very valid.
Oh, it's very valid. Our brains are phenomenally good at developing these patterns through observation. And again, the more you observe, the more you see, the stronger those neural connections become. And not doing stuff, you're not going to learn judgment from an artificial intelligence model. That's just not going to occur. You learn it from doing stuff. And as I tell my kids all the time, the more you do, the better you become. You just have to do stuff, and that's how you learn effectively.
Absolutely. So taking that and putting it back into the business context. So I guess the problem is you stand up an AI process tomorrow and you put a human in the loop and you've got some fairly senior experienced people. They're going to be effective because they used to do the work that you're automating with AI. They have the judgment and they're going to be able to make decisions where AI can't reach a conclusion or where they need to overrule AI, etc. They're going to be fairly good at that. The problem is those people will eventually leave for whatever reason. They will no longer be in the company and you have to replace them. And I guess the premise is you run out of people who've done the work, because if now no one's doing the work, we're just supervising the work. Therefore, the younger people who you're going to plug in to be that human in the loop don't have that judgment and are back in a position of being asked to judge the performance of AI and opine on specific outcomes without the benefit of that hard-won judgment. And what happens? They're lost? I don't know.
You bring up a valid point. I mean, it creates a whole series of downstream issues too. And if you want to take this to the nth degree, as you're bringing individuals up from the junior ranks to the senior ranks, and you're losing those younger people, those junior employees, and you're not educating them, you're not teaching them judgment. There's going to come a day when that leadership pipeline or that management pipeline just evaporates and there's nobody there. And that's a real concern going forward. And that was something else the author mentioned, I think was insightful as well. And you have to think past today, which most companies are not usually pretty good at, and think long term. You want to maintain this pipeline of people, of individuals that you train and grow and develop over time, because humans aren't going anywhere. And that's a really important thing to think about.
Yeah. No, that's right. It's easy to look at this just as a problem for that process and running out of judgment for that process. But the people that are the human in the loop in that process are tomorrow's senior managers and the day after's C-suite. And you sort of end up, squashing the whole talent pipeline if you're not careful.
Exactly. And there are corollaries to this in the past. There's a lot of corollaries just with other basic automation. I mean, look, there are skills that most humans no longer possess. There's artisanal skills of hand woodworking and things like that, which now have been replaced with CNC machines. And, finding people that can do that really hard, detail-oriented work, well, they're few and far between. And in the past, you could find a lot of them that were there. And I think in this case, you'd say, if we're not smart, this is different. If we're not smart, we're going to lose a whole generation of junior young people who are not taught judgment, and that has, I think, I'm sorry, other downstream effects outside of industry, just in general life, and that's not a good thing.
And I think the other example or the other aspect of this that the author pulled in, which I thought really resonated with me, was this idea that one of the other challenges to developing your own sense of judgment and learning from the situations with which you are presented when you are the human in the loop is you're being given something that's already been generated. You're being given an answer, a scenario, an output, and you're asked to evaluate it. That is a very different thought process than if you're given a blank sheet of paper and you're asked, come up with an approach for this, right?
Right.
I could give you two approaches. I go, hey, Peter, do you like A or B better? Most people are going to look at them and they're going to pick A or B. But if I gave you a blank sheet of paper and said, hey, Peter, how would you approach this problem? You might come up with something superior to A or B that would never have come out if you were just asked to pick between A and B.
I love that analogy. I think that is so true. I think you're spot on. And that's an important distinction to make.
Yeah. And I don't think I'd never thought about it in exactly this way, but you and I have talked many times on the podcast and with our clients and to anyone who will listen, right, about the way in which we use generative AI. And it always starts with we write the first draft of the content or speak the first draft of the content. We create the outline. We create the structure. We come up with the idea. And then we use AI to help fill in blanks and fine tune things and rearrange things. But there's something about starting with an organically created idea that gives you a very different end state than if you just say, "Oh, come up with an idea for this," or
absolutely, 100% absolutely. I could not agree with you more. It's back to the critic and creator. You're right, and when you just rely purely on AI and you're a junior person, you're not making any of these distinctions. Right. You're not stretching, because the brain is a muscle, and if you don't use it effectively, like a muscle, it atrophies.
Yeah.
And you have to be able to use it, and that's hard thinking. And some of these things are hard. Don't get me wrong. Thinking is not always easy, but you lose that ability to think through things, you create things when you're just relying on a model to spit stuff out for you.
Right. And the article pointed out something I thought was really interesting. It seemed obvious, but I hadn't really thought about it until I read it written out there. And that was that the way people design these human in the loop processes and the way that they insert that human into the loop is about using the human to make a go, no-go decision, a yes-no decision, a pass-fail decision, or whatever they're doing. But the process isn't designed to teach the human, right? They're using the human as a part of the process, but the process itself isn't designed to teach the human. So, I wonder, would a human in the loop look different if the model was being told, generate the answer and generate a set of considerations and reasons why you selected this answer and possible arguments against this answer, et cetera, and all of that was given to the human to review? That might make it more of a so-called teachable moment for the human than just, here's my output, do you agree or disagree?
No, I think that's an interesting take on it. I haven't thought of it that way, but I think that's a really interesting approach. Yeah, maybe. I think, but more fundamentally, I think you're right. I think you're at a really important point, but I think this brings up a lot of considerations when you're retooling processes in an organization and how you approach it. And I think it's always been, okay, we make a process better, faster, whatever it is. And, for most organizations, it's about control, and it's putting control functions in place. It's not, right. And the people that are in the control functions have the judgment knowledge that they've learned in the past to make those control decisions. And you're losing all of that. So when you replace processes now with artificial intelligence, you can't just think about it in isolation. You have to think about it more broadly, that in changing this process, if it's still a control function, what am I doing with the individuals? How am I dealing with it going forward? Your timeline almost has to be extended quite extensively, not just to here and now. I'm making this process faster. It's great. It's good. We got some immediate benefit from it. And then 3 years down the line, you're looking like nobody understands any of this. We have no idea how we even got here today.
That's such a fascinating idea that today's efficiency gain might have the unintended consequence of killing off the pipeline of people who could keep that process operating as designed in the future, because you're not giving them that fundamental training to let them become the effective human in the loop that you'll need in the future.
And we're so geared just culturally for short-term benefits. Like rarely, most people are not wired for the long-term benefits of their actions. And it's generally hard to be consistent over long periods of time for a lot of people. And organizations, certainly public organizations, are really wired quarter by quarter by quarter by quarter. Hence, you see we're laying off a number of people because of AI. But they're not thinking long-term. They're not compensated, so to speak, for long-term decisions. It's very hard to look at things long-term. And I think that's extraordinarily myopic and will have real negative consequences going forward.
I could not agree more. I think you raise a very interesting point. And in fact, we talk to a lot of companies who, have these arbitrary goals or objectives to implement X number of AI-powered workflows or this many use cases or whatever, right? That's very short-term thinking, because that's just saying, hey, let's count how many AI bots we can deploy. And it almost incents you not to take the long-term view of how do we do this in a way that preserves human capital and human knowledge inside the organization, and not just preserves it, continues to grow and cultivate new human knowledge and capital, which is 100%. The key issue here.
Yeah, no, that is the issue at the end of the day, I think. And I think the assumption is for a lot of organizations that they're going to need less human capital, and that seems to be the messaging that gets out in the news and the media quite a bit is, well, we need less human capital to do some of these roles, or we're going to, replace them with AI. And I think that is, and you and I will say this, and we've said this from the very beginning, that is incredibly myopic and just not the right vision to have, because one, people are not going anywhere. You don't want to live in a society where most people are unemployed. It's not a good thing. You need to retrain, upskill, use people, think about these processes, because what you're going to have are people that they're just going to focus on the high value stuff. And that's what you want. Right.
And even if you had less human capital, that just means the value of the human capital you have becomes higher. You have more and more of a dependency on them. So you still work yourself back to the same problem, which is, how do I not erode the capabilities of my humans by depriving them of learning opportunities because I've replaced some tasks with AI?
Right, and let's look, a simple case today that I think is happening rather quickly. And it was really one of the first cases for artificial intelligence out there that was, the most evident and obvious, and it was software development. And you and I have written code for decades at the beginning of our career, learned all the nuance of software development and how the machine operated and everything else. And now you have, Anthropic being one and OpenAI being another, saying that all the code that they develop is now developed with AI tools. Now, that's fine for a senior developer who's done this traditionally before and understands. It's not fine for a person who is just coming out of college and is doing the same thing.
Right.
That skill is still more so than ever, I think, required. But you're losing, the shift is, because developers are expensive, the shift is to fewer and fewer developers, more efficient senior developers. But now, how do you become a senior developer? I can become a senior developer on an AI tool, I can tell you that much.
It's the same problem all over again. I was talking to my friend Neil, who is a brilliant technologist, and he was using generative AI to get back into some coding. And he said, these tools are amazing if you actually already know exactly what you want the architecture to look like, how you want to design the application. If you understand these things and you can articulate those requirements, you'll get great output. But if you don't, you're not going to get that level of output. And so it's the same problem all over again, which is he can use those tools to create high quality software because he's done the hard work himself. He knows how the architecture should be. Someone who hasn't, is all they're ever going to be able to do is prompt AI tools to generate more code, but they aren't going to have that experience base to say, no, I want you to use this architecture instead of that architecture. Use this pattern, not that pattern.
And you've seen it, I've shown it myself with the work that I've done, and you've seen how fast I've done certain things, but I'm like you, I'm guiding the models in a way based on my experience and my knowledge of building systems for decades. I would have, if I didn't have that knowledge, I would be anywhere close to where I wound up as fast as I did. And that's all the experience that I've had. And that is invaluable in using these tools.
So it raises a whole bunch of questions about like what do you do about this? Like, obviously, I don't know how real it is, but I like the idea of maybe being able to design a process such that the AI helps educate the human on its decision process, so that the human has a chance to form a deeper insight into what's happening. I don't know if that would be effective. What else?
I
What
don't
else
know.
can we do?
I don't know what the answer is. I honestly don't know. I mean, it's a legitimate, it's a hard question. It's there's
Right.
we can riff about how many possible ways there are to fix this or make it better. I think in the short
Right.
term there are no easy answers, but I think the short term answer is to not doing, I'll call it, don't do stupid stuff by eliminating all your junior employees because you think you're going to replace them with AI. That is not the smart thing to do. I
Right.
mean, I think from a dollar perspective, maybe you think it is, but I think it's very short term thinking.
Yeah. I almost want to say give AI to your junior employees so that they can work with it and automate parts of their jobs, but don't replace them with it.
Right, right. And I think maybe that's at least the short term easier answer. Yeah, let them learn how to develop knowledge along with these tools and gain that
Right.
experiential knowledge that they require to make good judgment calls and not replace them out of the box. But that also requires more from education as well. Because education is not, I don't yet
Yes.
dealing with this particularly well. In many cases, they're not integrating it into their curriculums, and that's also important. You need to start young to start integrating these things and developing these with the right guidance, of course. You don't give the
I
tool
think
to a kid. And
to me, that's the real answer. The real answer is we need to, I want to say go back to the extent that we ever did this correctly, we need to be teaching people the right sort of skills. And chief amongst those is, you said it, 20 minutes ago, thinking. So
yes,
let's talk about thinking. Like when someone says you need to learn to think, what does that mean to you? Like how would you describe that?
I mean, thinking to me is, that's a good question. I may articulate it. It's not having a narrow view of how to solve a problem. It's having a broad, deep view of how to solve things or approach something. Not even solve, approach something. Like you're not looking at it unidirectionally. You're coming at it from 50 different angles, and you're connecting dots that previously maybe weren't connected before. It's that kind of high level thinking, I think, is you gain with age and knowledge. And
Yeah,
I guess if I had to qualify, that's thinking to me. That's being able to look at things very differently. And
yeah.
I don't know, what do you
I
think?
think I look at it as a collection of closely related things you have to be able to do. I think part of it is this concept of critical thinking or independent thinking, right? Which is being able to leverage past things you've learned or heard about, but not over rely on them, like maintaining your ability
Right.
to decide if what you've learned in the past applies in this case. So some
Wisdom.
level of independent thinking.
Yes.
I think that's important. I think equally important is the ability to clarify and focus on what really matters. What's the question here, right? When you get into a complex question, it's easier I get in meetings all the time where people are like blurting out lots of challenges,
Right.
but only a few of them are actually focusing on the actual underlying problem that needs to be solved, right? It's hard to separate the root cause of the problem from its effects and its symptoms. So I think even being able to identify a problem is a thinking skill.
Thinking skill.
We talk a lot about articulation and the ability to translate that into some communicable passage of words or whatever, like to articulate in a way that you can then share that knowledge with other people, which I think is hugely critical. And
Right.
then there's one that I struggle sometimes with the exact terminology, but for me, you can call it rationality, or you might call it scientific method, but it's how to spot fallacies, how to understand good logical thinking and identify fallacies and distractions
Yeah.
and bad thinking effectively, right?
That's
Because
hard. I
not
mean,
all thinking
that's
is good.
no, and many thinking is deeply flawed, and it gives the appearance of good, thoughtful thinking. But if you know what to look for, very often you will find it's based on a foundation of sand, and from there they
Yeah.
try to derive clear conclusions. But and that's a common thing. I mean, a lot of people do that. They take a grain of information and they run with it, not putting it into greater context. And
Yeah.
you have to be able to identify that type of flawed thinking. Going back to using a model, which can create anything, and very often it can create flawed thinking with the appearance of looking really good. And
Yeah.
you have to have the judgment and critical thinking skills to assess that.
So what would
But
you, if you were designing a college curriculum, not the entire thing, but if you were just saying, okay, I would, if in a perfect world, if I could say every student graduating from college should be required to take some of these courses, like what would you take? Like I would say they need to take some literature and comparative literature and writing courses to get the articulation problem down. That'd be one of
100%.
them. What else?
Oh, I'm with
What
you
else
on
would
that.
you
It's
put in
funny.
there?
It's funny you say that because I remember at one of our earlier podcasts, you were surprised by my answer. But I do think liberal arts thinking is incredibly important. And I will say history. I think history is interesting for me, and because I've always been a bit of a history aficionado, and I love old history books. And very often I have the conversation with individuals who will pontificate about, oh, things are bad. Like, you got to put it into context. Look at it over time. And you got to be able to. So for me, history is a way of analyzing a lot of information and putting it into context. Because you can't, if you take history out of context, it's meaningless. And that to me is a skill that needs to be taught.
That's a really good point, which is the history as the simple recitation of events and dates and things. No, but history
Right.
has the ability to synthesize and understand and start to. Do I even want to call it like develop systems thinking capability? Because you start to
Right.
say, how did this event trigger this later outcome, and what were
Very
the
important.
forces acting on? That's
Right.
I'd never thought of that. I like
Yes,
it.
very, very important. And I think
Interesting.
that's, most people don't appreciate that. It's, having that level of, look, history, if you look at it, like if you look at big events, you can't just look at the event in and of itself because that's what gets reported and spoken about. It's everything that goes around it that's far more important at the end of the day. And how did you get there? What pushed it there? What were the conditions that got it there? Like all this other stuff. And, it might
Yeah.
have been something that started 20 years before that. And I think that's all lost on people. They look at everything. Like
Yeah.
I get aggravated with the media period for a lot of reasons, but so much of it is just, I'm looking at this narrow view of the world. And I'm like, no, you can't look at the world that way. You have to put it into context because then you get a different appreciation for what's happening. And that's incredibly important.
The butterfly effect. The butterfly effect.
Fact.
All right. So,
Yeah.
continuing our ideal curriculum, I want to now throw in philosophy, specifically courses
Yes.
around logic, right? Logic courses, which are kind of entry level
Very
philosophy
important.
courses, I think are
Yes.
really good. Yeah.
And it's oddly enough, I've never taken philosophy classes, but I've taken a lot of logic classes because as an engineering student, a lot of them were based on logic and mathematical
Right.
logic. And so I took a ton of those classes. So for me, it makes sense.
Yeah. What else would you put on the curriculum?
I don't want to go back into some of the STEM stuff, but some of the classes, engineering classes I took were really systems thinking types classes because in large engineering systems, large complex systems, like let's think of something like a fighter jet for argument's sake. No one individual can understand that, but you break it into called black boxes that interact with each other. So you understand the impact of systems thinking and compartmentalizing certain things and where do you fit in a broader picture? Which again, at the time when I was learning these classes and taking these things, I despised them. But
Yeah.
looking back on it now, it certainly shaped how I thought about things more
So it's
profoundly
funny
than I
because
thought.
I feel the same about some of my early computer science courses. Not the
Yes.
most technically challenging of my courses, but they probably did more to shape the way I think about problems than anything. CS 141, thank you, Dr. Noonan, was, 141, 242 were like 2 semesters of structured programming, but it was really about how do you take a problem, isolate it, break down your approach into a structured approach to do it, like it was systems thinking.
Right. Yeah, 100%.
And it was arduous. And at times I'm like, oh, why am I like making this problem so much more complicated? I could probably just write 20 lines of code and be done. But the thought patterns that we developed in those courses have literally been with me for the rest of my
Yes.
life.
Yeah. Yeah. Same thing.
Yeah.
Same as me. I mean,
What about math? Would you throw any mathematics in?
Oh, yeah. Honestly, it's funny because so I was dual major. I mean, engineering and math. So, and a
Okay.
lot of the math classes, and I won't say there's a lot of different types of math, but a lot of the theoretical math classes I took,
Yeah.
I would say shaped my thinking more than anything. So I took, I'll never forget, it was the classic 100-page book. It was, I can't, the title of the book escapes me, but the class was called Mathematics of Analysis. It was an analysis class. Like you got into the weeds on all the theorems and corollaries and everything else. And I remember
Right.
sitting down, and it was a very tiny class of people, and it was a 4 credit class. I took it over 2 semesters. It was one of the most difficult classes, and teacher, he was great. He was a good teacher. He loved to see his students be successful. Anyway, I countless hours writing 40, 50, 60-page proofs on what was a one-line, corollary or theorem in math. And I would spend, 2 weeks doing this. But
Wow.
it really taught you very well how to form a structured argument, how to look at it logically, how to go step by step by step and understand that I wrote something 5 pages ago. It now has an implication over here 5 pages later. So I got to start all over again because I made a mistake. And the
Right.
assumptions that I made were incorrect. And again, not time, wouldn't have ever thought, but it had, from a thinking perspective, a very profound implications on how I approached problems. It was again, I won't say I loved the class. It was so hard, but it really was great for me to understand that kind of thinking that comes with mathematics.
That's really fascinating. I can see where that would be very, very useful. All right, so I want to nominate next on the curriculum some form of lab-based science class. I don't care if it's chem lab, a physics lab, PChem, bio,
I did this
but
too.
do something with right. Do something with lab work because I think
Yes.
that helps with scientific theory. It helps, and it helps with a lot of other
100%.
more subtle skills, right?
Yeah.
Documentation, keeping a lab book, keeping track of complex outputs, right? All of that, like
All that.
doing something practical in the lab is a great skill to have.
And I think the important part about that is you're taking a theory that you looked at in a book and you're making it real, and you're recognizing that what you learned in class, it does not map to reality one to one.
Ah, interesting point. Yes, which is very relevant since at the end of the day, all data that we have is only a representation of reality. It isn't reality. It represents some aspect of reality. And that is an important distinction to keep in mind.
Reality is not clean. It's not black and white.
So, all right, the other one, as we were talking, I thought about another thinking skill that people should have and how I would give that to them. And that is testing. You might, I think on your initial reaction, people would say, well, that's not really a thinking skill. But one of the things, again, I learned in my early programming days was how to do structured testing, how to do thorough and systematic testing. And
Yes.
it's funny because that is a skill that over my career, I have seen frighteningly few software developers who are actually really, really good at testing.
Oh,
And
yeah.
yet
Very
I
few.
think even if you're not developing software, if you're doing anything, you should be able to think about how would I test this output? How would I test this business process? How would I, look in banking,
Oh,
we
I
do
agree.
controls testing all the time, and designing a good controls test is almost as hard as designing the control in the first place.
Well, I think what happens is over time, especially in business, testing takes time. It's not something you can just do fairly easily, especially in a complex system. I mean, I did my fair amount of testing, and I won't say I was good at it or loved it because I didn't. But it's incredibly important. But I think it's always in the sense of, there's always this urgency to get stuff done, and that's usually the first thing that
Right.
unfortunately goes.
Right. So
You know.
my last one in my curriculum, I'm gonna go take a veer off to the left
A
here,
detour for a bit.
back to the liberal arts. So here's my premise. A lot of what humans are going to be asked to do in supervising and monitoring AI is sometimes it's going to be up to them to make the ethical decisions, the safety decisions, the responsible
Yeah.
AI decisions.
Yes.
So I think that we should require our hypothetical students to take some art classes to develop
Yes.
empathy. And
Yes.
it could be
Yes.
music,
Yes.
right? It could be music, it
Anything.
could be fine art, visual arts, poetry, but take art classes, learn to feel and learn empathy, because that will
Yes.
be really critical in making some of these judgment calls.
Oh, I couldn't agree with you more. For those reasons, and I think a multitude of other reasons, there are enormous benefits into working that muscle in the brain. Um, it, it's it makes you see things very uniquely having that skill, and I think everybody should have that skill. And I think again, it's one of those ones that unfortunately has fallen by the wayside. Unfortunately, because it's had profound implications on me over my life.
Right.
But I love that.
So
I think
is
it's
anyone going
such
to
an
sign up
awesome
for our
idea.
curriculum? Do you think anyone will
Yes,
sign up for this curriculum?
they should. They'd be wise to.
It it's the it's David and Peter's AI readiness curriculum,
I think we should have
which
the
is
David
funny
and Peter
because
University.
let's do it. We have to figure out the colors, the mascot, the logo.
We can do that.
It's a foregone conclusion. You're going to want to locate it in some warm climate.
Of course.
Which
I'm thinking like, the Virgin Islands.
I'm not going to push back on that.
I think you are.
Yeah. So here's what's striking about this, and we didn't plan this, right? Like you and I never talked about the idea of a curriculum. This just happened as we were talking right now,
Yeah.
and I'm struck by the fact that nowhere in that did we say that we're going to teach people to use AI. Like we're talking about the fundamental skills. Like anyone
I
can
know.
teach them to use AI. And if they learn all the things in our curriculum, they can teach themselves to use AI just the way you and I have over the years.
Right.
So it goes back to we're
No.
teaching them fundamentals, not practicals.
Well, and so you and I recently did a session with professionals. And one of the things that we did, in fact, talk about is it's just real fundamental skills that are the ones that are hard to come by that you really need to learn or relearn if you've lost them. And it's the
Yeah.
AI skills we can teach you. It's everything else that I can't teach you.
Yeah.
Not easily, at least.
Right. I can learn facts on my own. It's the skills and the thinking patterns that I need to have indoctrinated into me when I'm at a university. Right.
Right,
And then,
exactly.
yeah, it's the old, corny, but it's the, teach a man to fish. Right.
No, but that's spot on, though. I think that's very true. And you and I for we've spoken about this. I think in many ways the trend in education is veering, I think, off in the wrong direction. And these basic fundamental skills are incredibly important, and they're getting
Yeah.
lost. And that's really, unfortunately, it's deeply troublesome for the future.
Yeah, I mean, and we could tick off so many problems. It's teaching to a standardized test. We know that isn't really
Oh, it's
helping
a
kids
problem.
learn to think. COVID certainly didn't help for people who were in school and affected by that.
No,
Anti-science movements don't help at all.
nope,
And then
nope,
just
nope.
the general fear of AI in a lot of educational settings isn't helping because people
No,
spend more time
no.
freaking out about we have to keep AI out of the classroom
Yeah.
instead of, okay, how do we use this effectively?
And I think that's a big, no, you're 100% right. And I think that's a huge problem. And a lot of professors, arguing that it shouldn't be in teaching, I think is a real unfortunate thing. And you're right, there's a multitude of reasons. We could riff on about why, education is going sideways for a ton of different reasons. I mean, it's unfortunate. I don't think it sets us up well in the future, or a lot of people in the future, for using these tools very effectively. And that's not a good thing. It's not a good thing for
So,
competitiveness. It's not a good thing for people's jobs. It's not a good thing.
so if anyone is, in college, thinking about going to college, or if you're hiring, if you're hiring early career people, think about what we said. We're not guaranteeing results, but think about what we said about hiring for competencies or framing, structuring your education to build these thinking competencies. You can get AI specific skills at will if you
Right.
have the right competencies underlying that.
Right. And it's funny because you hear all these companies looking to hire those with AI skills, but I'm like, I'm sorry, that's the wrong thing to be looking for. Look for people that can think. And then if they don't have those skills, teach them those skills. That's easy to
Right.
teach. A lot easier to
Right.
teach.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think I mentioned this before, but when I was very young and early 20s and hadn't done much interviewing and was going around, we were interviewing at college campuses and we are hiring a lot of people from engineering and computer science and MIS programs and business programs. And I met a candidate who was a history major, but she was the most articulate, well-spoken, intellectually curious person I spoke to that day.
Yeah.
And we went out on a limb and made a job offer, and she was wildly successful at a software company as a history major. And that always stuck with me as, it is not just the skills you have, it's the way you think and the learning skills, the thinking skills that you've honed that impact your
No,
ability to succeed.
100%. It's similar. I remember my first job, the owner of the company, and there was an elevator conversation one day, and he's like, Peter, you ever kind of notice how so many musicians are really good software developers? Like, he'd put it together, how important it was. It's true.
Right. Really interesting. All right. So I think, wrapping up on this article, I think it's safe to say I found it a worthwhile read. I think it was a good read.
Yes.
Again, if anyone wants to read it, it's How Do Workers Develop Good Judgment in the AI Era by David Duncan in the Harvard Business Review magazine.
Yep.
I think, though, he lays out the problem. I think we have our own view on how you solve that problem that is around fundamentally teaching people thinking skills that seem to be not in vogue right now.
No, and I think an awareness of the problem is critical because it's going to take time to solve. And I think at least I want to make a lot of
Yeah.
people aware that this is an issue and it will be a bigger issue.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
I think
David,
that's
is it
right.
a time for our lightning round?
I think it's time for the lightning round, Peter. Are you ready for this?
I'm ready. You go.
All right. What should we let me pick one off our list of curated topics. I like this one. I like this is going to be a layup for you because I know this is something you know way more about than I do. But quantum computing. So IBM has predicted that 2026 will be the year in which quantum computing actually outperforms classical computing, traditional computing on some problems somewhere. You of the two of us, you're the only one that's actually seen a quantum computer. So,
I actually
what do you think
touched a
about
quantum
this?
computer. I actually touched a quantum computer. So yeah, I mean,
And you live to
somehow
tell
I'm
the story.
imbued with and I'm imbued with some special knowledge because of that. What do I think about my thoughts on quantum computing? That it's one of those things that's always around the corner, and that corner seems to get longer and longer and longer. Now, that way they phrase that, it's so broad. Predictions are notoriously for being wildly inaccurate, but the way they worded that prediction, so maybe they do find success in a particular problem and solving it with quantum computers, but will real general purpose quantum computers be available anytime soon? I don't believe so. I've heard anything from 5 to 25 years by people that are far more knowledgeable than I am. I do think it's ways off. There are some significant engineering challenges still to be solved. So I don't yet see it.
I agree with you, and I note that a lot of people are saying that having a true fault-tolerant quantum computer, which means you could actually rely on it being correct most of the time, we're still at least 5 years away from that. So
I think at least.
yeah.
And I look at
Do you think?
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was going to ask you, do you think they'll ever replace traditional computers, or do you think they'll always be used for specialized use cases, cybersecurity, finance, drug discovery, whatever?
I think they'll be used for those, exactly, for things like that where that level of performance is really required. But for everything that we do, traditional classic computing is, I mean, obviously we've seen massive gains, and I'm still plenty of massive gains ahead of us. I don't, but let me frame this for a second. So if you look at a quantum computer, so where I saw it, it was in my alma mater, and I went into the building where they actually deployed this. And for those that don't know, I went to RPI, and they deployed it in what was originally an old church. So it's a 120-year-old church. It's a beautiful brick building, and it's been a computer center for decades. It's where I did a lot of computer programming back when I was an undergrad there. So in order to get this quantum computer, it was an IBM quantum computer, into the building, first I had to remove a lot of the stained glass windows because it was so large, and I had to go through the windows with a crane. But before they even did any of that, it weighs so much that they had to put up steel beams in the basement and buttress the floor to make sure that it can sustain the weight of this thing. Take that a step further. It also requires specialized cooling to drive down the temperature dramatically. I want to say near sub-zero. I'm sorry, near absolute zero. So way, way, way down. So all sorts of specialized cooling units to make sure this thing runs effectively. That's not something you deploy or replace.
No, no, that's a very special commitment. And so what you're saying is I should not hedge my bets that the iPhone 37 has a quantum chip in it.
No, 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 no,
Okay.
no. You're not seeing these things
There's
generally available anytime soon.
there's something poetic too about the fact that they put it in a church. And I'm not sure I can
I
articulate
know.
why, but it's the fact that like quantum physics is closer to religion than to
Yes.
science, right? Like everything else we
Yes.
have in science is very deterministic. And then you come along with quantum physics and it says a qubit in a quantum computer can exist in multiple states at the same time.
Exactly. Well,
And your algorithms are based on the probability of knowing what state a qubit exists in.
exactly.
That's
So I remember
that's closer to religion than science for me. That's
Well, you remember what
hard to
Einstein
get my
said
head
when
around.
he, when he ditto. You remember what Einstein said when he was talking about quantum computing is that God does not play dice, and that was his famous quote. And I think it's
Yeah.
relevant, even though quantum physics impacts our life in many ways, and it actually
Right.
impacts classical computing as well when you get down to a certain size. So these are not theoretical things; they're very real. But I do think quantum computing to me is in many ways like fusion. It's an intractable, extraordinarily difficult engineering problem that is yet to be solved. I'm not saying it won't be; it will be at some point. It's just I think scientists and engineers typically grossly underestimate the complexity of solving a problem like this.
Oh yeah, yeah,
And it's funny because you say it says next year, and then when you talk to the person that runs the quantum computer division at IBM, he will say within the next 5 years we'll have most of the engineering issues solved. So you tell me what's true. They
right,
both can't be true.
right. Unless you believe in quant. No, just kidding. So, all right. Do you want to pick the next lightning round topic?
Yeah, let's pick the next one.
What do you like?
I think this is one that you and I, well, you've spoken about this more than I have, so I'm going to drop this one on your lap, and it's deepfakes and the
Okay.
erosion of trust.
Oh yeah, yeah. So this was disturbing to me because there was research published that said that even when you tell someone that a video you're about to show them isn't real, and then you show them the video and then you ask them to make decisions based on what was in that video, it still impacts their judgment.
Yes.
You can say it isn't real, and it still impacts their judgment. It reminds me of two things. It reminds me of, first of all, of placebos. You can tell someone that there's a placebo or that there's a greater than 50% chance they're receiving a placebo, and it still works. You can actually, there've been cases where they literally say to someone, this is a sugar pill, and it works. The other one is this, you've seen the tests where you've got a human being who has their hand in a box and there's a rubber hand coming out of the box and it looks like it's their hand coming out of the box and they know it's not their hand. And yet
Right.
when the researcher suddenly pulls out a hammer and smacks the rubber hand, which is positioned
Feel it.
about where their hand would be, right? They jump and scream and pull back as if, right? And their brain knows their hand is not sticking out on the table. They look at it like that is a rubber hand. But when that hammer hits the rubber hand, they scream. So this deep fake problem, this is why, I've been saying for a long time, labeling, a lot of people have proposed different labeling schemes. Hey, we should just label as AI generated everything that is AI generated.
Right.
And I have two fundamental problems with that. Number one is everything is going to have some degree of AI augmentation to it. So where do you draw the line? Because if everything is labeled as AI generated, then it becomes a meaningless distinction.
Correct.
So if I use AI to fine tune the wording in an email that I typed, do I now have to put a label on it that says it's AI enhanced or AI
Right.
generated? Right. So like it's meaningless. But more importantly, like that study shows, it doesn't impact people's perception. You can tell them it's fake and they are still going to believe it's true. This is why no amount, like when someone gets an idea put into their head, if they read a headline that's like, aha, I knew it, it sort of reinforces maybe their preconceived notion. You could come out and tell them, actually, that article is entirely fake, it's been disproven, but they're not going to let go of the boost in confidence they got for that preconceived
No,
notion. It's just human nature.
it's human nature.
So I like, and especially when it's visual, like our visual cortex overrides so many things, right? You can be
Yes, I know.
told that something is impossible, but you see it. Like I've gone over the last few years, I've gone to some very, very good close-up magic shows. The Millionaire's Magician in Manhattan. If you ever have a chance to see Mr. Cohen, I forgot his first name, but he's the Millionaire Magician,
Never heard of
and fantastic. And everything is done within a couple of feet of your eyes, and so you know what he's doing isn't possible, but because your eyes see it, your brain just gives in. Like
your brain
what
gives
you
in.
see overrides everything else you know and think. And it doesn't matter who you are. I guarantee you see a show like this and you're thinking, I know it's not real, but that's real, right? So deepfakes are
Yeah,
really troubling. Like how do we overcome that? I don't know.
I don't
It
think you
scares
do. I
me.
don't think you can, and I don't think they look. Let's be real. Deep fakes, yes, I would say not AI deep fakes, but the faking of visual imagery has existed from the beginning of man, and it's never going to go
Yeah.
away. And I think it goes back to good judgment, good critical thinking skills, and questioning things within context, i.e., history, see if it actually makes any sense. But it's
I'm
not
so
always
glad
easy
you
to even
said
do
that.
that.
I'm glad you said that. In fact, I'm going to make a plea to anyone who's listening. There's a pair of images I've been looking for years. I saw them years ago, 6 or 7 years ago, maybe longer now, and I have not been able to find them. And it's about, Peter, your point, which is that you don't need AI to manipulate people with images, and you don't need to
No,
change the images. And this pair of photographs was of I believe it was a U.S. president. I don't even remember who it was. It might have been Obama, but it could have been someone earlier, standing on a stage delivering a presentation. And the only thing that was different was the angle and the timing of when the two images were taken. They're both black and white images taken in the same room within minutes of each other. But the compositional choices of the first photographer made it look like this man was speaking to a largely empty room and was sort of shouting into the wind. You got this very like
right.
desolate feeling. You got the feeling like whatever he was saying, no one cared. There weren't even enough people there to fill the room. Same exact setting taken from a different angle within minutes actually showed that the room was full of people in the middle of the room and very engaged crowd, and it gave you a completely different feeling. So, it just reinforces that you don't need AI to deceive people with images
No,
or anything else. We've been doing it forever.
right.
But my plea, by the way, is if anyone knows which photographs I'm speaking of, please, I would love to find them again because I think they're a
I
very powerful example of perspective.
I vaguely remember what you're talking about. I vaguely remember. I have to go digging for it as well. But I think you're correct. I think it was Obama. But I do recall. I feel like I recall that. But you're right, though. I
Yeah.
mean, look, this has been happening since the beginning of certainly since the beginning of photography and the manipulation of images, and the composition matters enormously into what emotions get evoked by the viewer.
Right. And by the way, deep fake detectors are not the answer. They simply do not work. In fact,
They don't work.
I have seen more problems caused by false positives with deep fake detectors than anything. People get accused all the time of using AI because some
Right.
deep fake detector declares it AI generated. I
I
want to put
mean,
in one more plug. I listened yesterday, so one of my favorite podcasts, other than ours, of course, is called 99% Invisible. If you've never listened to 99% Invisible, if you're curious about the world and the way it works and the way it's designed, 99% Invisible is fantastic. And the most recent episode was about the M dash and how the M dash has been villainized by people who believe that it is the arbiter of what's AI generated. And so it goes into like how long the M dash has existed and
yeah,
why the M dash
that just
exists.
is.
Fascinating article. And did you know, for example, that Pride and Prejudice has a very large number of M dashes in it? Emily
I did not
Dickinson
know.
used M dashes more than any other modern writer. Um, you'll learn a lot if you listen to this episode. It's a
I,
short one, maybe 35 minutes. Totally worth it.
I got.
But,
I will have to listen to that then. That's fascinating to me. I did not know that.
so my takeaway on this is I think it's an issue we will have to grapple with for a long time. I think that the solution is never going to be predicated on us being able to detect what is a manipulation, what is a fake. We just can't, right? It comes back to when I, as you know, I'm a wristwatch collector, very modest part-time wristwatch collector. And when people are always coming on to various message boards saying, "Hey, I want to buy a watch. Is this real? Is this fake?" Everyone always says, the fakes are so good you can't tell sometimes.
You can't tell.
Don't buy the watch, buy the seller, right?
Yes, that is absolutely true.
So that's what we need to be thinking about with deep fakes and things like that.
That's a great
it's
example.
the provenance, right?
Yeah.
It's the
No, I think
lineage, it's the provenance of the image, not the actual image itself, that will tell you whether you should trust it or not.
I think that's an awesome way of looking at it, because you're spot on. You buy the provenance, not the. You're right, because they've gotten so good you can't tell the difference anymore. And look, I played with ray tracing software decades ago, which was really good, and you could see real images that look phenomenal. It's always going to be there. You just have to, like you said, look at the provenance.
Right.
So.
Yep. I kind of miss the early days when you could spot an AI-generated image because, like, the people had 6 fingers and arms bent at weird angles, and But as soon as they got really good, that was the easy tells were gone.
The fact that there are fully AI-generated videos and advertisements in this year's Super Bowl is very telling. That's how good it's gotten.
Yeah. Maybe that's a quiz. I have not paid any attention to the ads coming up in the Super Bowl. I will watch the Super Bowl. I'm going to see if I can, I think if I remember to, I'll try to make a list of which ones I think are real and which ones I think are AI generated. Maybe it'll be obvious and this will be a dumb exercise, but maybe I'll be fooled. I don't know. I'll see what happens.
I don't know. Yeah, well, if you're fooled, you're not going to know, and it's going to look real. And they've gotten really good.
Yeah.
It's crazy
really
how good
interesting.
It's fascinating.
Well, Peter, it's been another great conversation.
Yes.
Thank you. And,
thank you.
And to everyone who joined us, thank you. Yeah, thank you for being here for episode number 50 of what is now the All In on Data podcast, formerly known as the Call Me Data podcast, but going back to our roots, calling it the All In on Data podcast. Signing off, I'm David Gleason, co-founder of All In on Data, and
I'm Peter Memon, co-founder of All In on Data. Thanks, everybody.